Hi there, this is AJ, your host. I just wanted to take some time to thank you on behalf of Mystery Creations and to wish you all a happy holidays and joyous new year. This is our Yule special with Brandon Weston. It is an extended episode with a dedication and some toasts, posts, and stories from our friends at the end. Please enjoy and take care. What goodies were you able to find on your end for today?
Well, so we're talking winter solstice, correct? Yeah. So, yep. I guess from an Ozark perspective, we can roll sort of winter solstice in with other winter traditions in general. And I know it's for a long time, it's been kind of seen as a time of liminal space where, the veil between this world and the other world is thin. So you have lots of great ghost stories that are told and sometimes are set at Christmas Eve specifically, or around the winter solstice. So it's this time where, because the veil is thinner, magical practitioners and healers sometimes use these times as times to do maybe extra work or works focused on with a specific intention. It's also Christmas Eve is seen as a initiation time, so a lot of healers and magical practitioners that want to pass down certain gifts or verbal charms or things like that might choose Christmas Eve or winter solstice as that time. I have found that more of the neo-traditional practitioners, so you have the traditional practitioners who are more connected to the old Ozark culture. They tend to be a little bit more conservative, not necessarily politically conservative all the time, but they tend to be a little bit more religiously conservative, and also conservative as far as the old. They stick to a lot of the old taboos and rules surrounding a lot of the practices in the Ozarks. And then you have the neo-traditional practitioners who are still influenced by, Ozark traditions. They incorporate the same ideology about the land and things like that. But then they also bring in more modern practices, but then also practices from other traditions. So the neo-traditional practitioners are likely to bring in more of the equinox and solstice traditions, which is what I found. So the traditional practitioners maybe would have focused more on Christmas Eve or Old Christmas, January 6th. And whereas, neo-traditional practitioners might be more likely to focus on or add to the winter solstice. So I'm a neo-traditional practitioner. I incorporate traditional witchcraft from European traditions as well as a whole lot of Ozark stuff. So for me, I like to celebrate the solstice and keep to the Christmas Eve traditions as well. So there's a lot of good magical practices and things that go on. It's a divination time. I guess in one way I've thought about it, the old Ozarks, people really didn't get together very much, even family. You have the family that you lived with and the family that was kind of in the area. But a lot of times people only really got together as a community a couple times a year, usually centered around church holidays, things like that. But Christmas Eve was a big party time in the Ozarks. And that was the time when everybody got together. And not only, the living relatives, but also there was a time of ancestor appreciation. So people would go to graveyards and tell the tombs. They would, tell the grave sites, everything that happened in the past year. So it was a big party time, which is why I think there's a lot of magical and mundane traditions surrounding, these winter holidays, because everybody would have been together. So there would have been that would have been the best opportunity to pass information, pass down stories, songs, whatever you needed to pass around would be a good time.
That reminds me of something I read recently about the Norse traditions, where they would do high symbols, which are more like ceremonies to the gods, and then they would do low symbols, which are basically gatherings for the people. And I think that would classify as both. And they would basically sit around a fire and tell stories, say boasts to their or toasts to their ancestors, and tell boasts of things that they've done throughout the year that they were really proud of, winning a battle, or bringing in the biggest fish or buck, something like that, for the solstice meal. So that's kind of interesting.
I mean, to talk about like the boasts, that reminded me of. I mean, there are good traditions, Christmas Eve traditions about, sharing sort of big fish tales, about, and comparing stories about, you might have caught that, or shot that big buck, but I caught this big fish, and like things like that are always interesting to look at. And it's also interesting. I mean, you talk about the Scandinavian traditions, and certainly a lot of pan-European traditions are expressed in the Ozarks. So we have kind of things that we have developed here, but a good chunk of what we have has been inherited through generations of, storytelling and passing down things. So, you still find people who do things like wassailing. So they'll, making a big, usually, well, it depends on where you are, but a lot of times nowadays it's non-alcoholic, but in the old days it would have been a moonshine or a rum punch of some sort that people would take around and distribute to different houses while they sang carols and things like that. So that's a tradition that comes by way of, Anglo-Saxon, British traditions. So there's lots of inherited traditions. One is telling the bees too. So, people would go out and tell the tombs. They would report the year to their dead ancestors and things like that. But then another important thing to do was to tell your bees everything that happened as well. So if you kept beehives, Christmas Eve, people would go out and report the year to the bees so that the bees wouldn't be, out of the loop. But they would also do magical practices surrounding this. So people would, if, there were great needs within the family, you could go out on Christmas Eve and tell the bees, and the bees could take care of it throughout the year. So then this was a tradition that's inherited from, I found it in German sources, as well as, sort of pan-British Isles tradition as well.
Excellent. If I drop off, the power just flickered here.
No problem. I'll stick around and wait for you.
All right. We had some pretty severe flooding recently. It wiped out multiple highways.
Wow. Oh my God.
So they've been working on the power systems and that recently.
Wow.
So I'm worried.
Well, I'm glad you guys must be on higher ground. Good.
We are. We were also closer to the coast, so everything's kind of designed to drain into the ocean, which is very lucky for us. But gas is on short supply, and the stores got bought out pretty quickly, which they're just now starting to restock. So it's been pretty rough.
Yeah. Wow.
But luckily, I'm paranoid, and I planned for these. So we have 3 weeks worth of food stocked up. In beans and lentils and rice. So we're good.
Oh yeah, I inherited the similar paranoia from my parents. They live out in the woods, so they always carry, or they always keep around dry goods and foods and stuff. So I always have basically an entire cabinet full of dry beans and rice and stuff at any given time. So
You got to
yeah,
these days.
it's always a good idea, just in case.
Yeah. And speaking of lean times, the solstice tradition of kind of wishing back
Right.
the sun is saying, okay, we're starting to get low on food. We need the sun to come back so we can start
Right.
planting again.
Yeah, so in the Ozarks, it's a bonfire time, which reflects that sun.
Yeah.
In more recent times, the bonfires in the Ozarks would still have been outside, but in a lot of cases, they were brought indoors. And so you have, your fireplace where you have a rip roaring fire while you're having your, solstice or Christmas party, things like that. That's still a traditional thing to do. That have the Yule log on the fire, even though
Yeah.
in a lot of cases people don't really know the origins of the Yule log. They still have it as a part of their rites, as a part of their ceremony.
It's you're keeping the fire going for
Yeah.
the ancestors.
Also, the tradition of seeing the sun in mistletoe. So mistletoe is considered a sun plant, a plant of light, and so in the Ozarks, in day-to-day rituals and rites, it's used in divination traditions, also protection traditions, things like that, where it always has an association with fire and light and brightness, dispelling darkness, things like that. So mistletoe is one of those
Okay.
ancient traditions that is still celebrated around the Ozarks. Every solstice I go out and gather my mistletoe, and of course the tradition is to gather it on the solstice, because it does have this association with light. You are basically gathering up the last bits of sunlight to bring into your home to keep you through. And in the Ozarks, traditionally, you only hang it up in your house during the 12 days of Christmas, and then you burn it. So that, it's bad luck to keep any greenery in the house, according to the legends. It's bad luck to keep any of that stuff in your house past the 12 days of Christmas. So people would bring in all sorts of, red cedar boughs and pine boughs and things like that, mistletoe. But then afterwards, they would have usually a ceremonial fire where they would burn everything. And it's interesting to look at Old Christmas, because Old Christmas falls at the end of the 12 days of Christmas, what a lot of people consider to be Epiphany. In the sort of Protestant Ozarks, Epiphany wouldn't really have been much of a thing until Catholic immigrants came in and had Epiphany traditions, but they kept January 6th as Old Christmas. So up until the late 1800s in the Ozarks, we were still using the Julian calendar instead of the Gregorian calendar, and you see that actually across rural areas in Europe as well. Basically, these hillfolk communities in the backwoods, they didn't get the message that everybody changed to the Gregorian calendar, so they were still using the Julian calendar, which is a lunar calendar. So Ozarkers were using it, well into the 1800s. And so when finally, the communities built up enough, people, it was hard to use a different calendar from, the towns that were around you. People begrudgingly adopted the new calendars, the Gregorian calendars. And basically it changed the date of Christmas. So in the Gregorian calendar, Christmas falls on December 25th. Old Christmas, based on the Julian calendar, falls on January 6th. So it's kind of a nice fit, actually. So there are lots of sort of Old Christmas, but also Epiphany traditions, end of the 12 days of Christmas, that are celebrated in the Ozarks. There's a lot of people that still have two different Christmases, or sometimes, what was traditional was to just party the entire time. So you would party from sometimes from the solstice all the way to the 6th of January, But in most cases, it would have been, Christmas Eve through January 6th, Old Christmas or Epiphany. And you just keep partying the entire time. And a lot of that has to do with, those old traditions of welcoming back the sun. So keeping watch was really important. And I think, I don't know if I'm correct in this, but my theory is that, the partying, which sometimes was all night partying, was a way for people to connect to that idea of keeping watch for the sun to come back, that sort of thing.
Yeah. With that, what are some specific Ozark traditions that you would do during 12 days?
Well, so it's gathering mistletoe is an important one. Also, just the idea of feasting, I think, is probably our most important tradition. A lot of our traditions are based in food, and I mean, you can see that across different cultures as well. Where if you have a culture that is really on a day-to-day basis, you sometimes have to worry about food in the old days, especially.
Yep.
Being able to have a time of the year where you feast is a really important thing. And it's also, when you think about it, it's a healing act. I mean, being able to fatten yourself up a little bit at one time of the year, that might be the thing that gets you through the winter, or, that gets you through the hard times that are maybe to come. So food is always an important part of Ozark culture. It's at the heart of a lot of different traditions. So there, of course, are traditions around cooking, sharing meals with people. Also, having meals that are made across the generations. So, for instance, something might be started by a grandmother, and then, their child would add to it, and then the grandchildren would add to it, and then the great grandchildren, so on, would add to it. And so this idea of every family sort of bringing pieces together on something, and a lot of times it's something like a fruit cake, or something that involves a lot of different ingredients. So everybody would kind of bring in these things as a way of symbolically bringing together the family, as you are physically bringing together this item of food. But then also there are lots of food related traditions with the little people and land spirits. So this is a time, anytime you have a feast or a party or anything like that, you never want to leave out your spirits. So you don't want to leave out the ancestors. You don't want to leave out the little people or the land spirits or the house spirits either. So people would traditionally on Christmas Eve leave out food. And it's usually a sampling of whatever meal was going on. So there's always kind of a designated weirdo in the family that always, sticks to these old traditions. And I'm kind of that person in my family. So I'll always Christmas Eve make a plate for the little people and leave it outside. And sometimes people would leave little plates of food inside the house on the mantelpiece is popular, kind of up where it's not going to get disturbed, things like that. But that's a really important thing because, in the old days, the little people and the land spirits were as important to your survival as, good rain or sunshine, things like that. The idea that, even if it was perfect weather, if you didn't have the land spirits and the little people on your side, you weren't going to be able to get a good harvest or good crop of anything. So, keeping them safe, keeping them happy, especially, house brownies, spirits in the home, making sure that they're happy so that, people don't get sick in your family, the house doesn't burn down, things like that.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Some of our traditions were we would have a Yule log, usually in this case, because we didn't have an actual fireplace in the house, we would have it set up with an actual log with candles in it, and we would burn candles the whole time. And then in summertime, we would have a bonfire and burn the log.
Oh, that's a great tradition.
But yeah, It'd be usually be the summer solstice that we would do it. A lot of my family was Protestant, but we had a lot of traditions that are old
Mm-hmm.
English, old French traditions that just stuck with the family. But my mother was a practitioner, and so she she would give offerings to the little people outside. She never did it inside. We do cookies and milk when I
Mm-hmm.
was young for Santa Claus, which
Oh
is the
yeah,
same sort of
absolutely.
thing. And I think those traditions of giving food to the little people in your home became the Santa Claus traditions that we uh, we
Yeah,
do
yeah, I could
today.
definitely see that. The idea of, you know, sort of petitioning this spirit figure for blessings and good presents and things like that with food and drink. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I really like the tradition, like putting the candles in the log, and that's one that I've seen elsewhere pop up too. Especially these days, people don't have fireplaces a lot of the times unless you live in an older home. Like here in my house, I don't have a fireplace or wood stove or anything, so usually my tradition is candle based. Or oil lamp
Yeah.
based, and you see that a lot, even in older houses that had fireplaces. Candles were still important at this time, making luminarias out of like paper sacks and things like that, sometimes with very intricate patterns cut into them and putting them outside. It's this idea of this dark time of the year bringing in lots of light and bringing in lots of examples of this light, but it has older origins as well. And it's kind of, a lot of times people just do traditions because they're traditions, but I have met practitioners, or even traditional practitioners, that, they this time of the year they bring in more candles and light and things like that as a way of helping spirits, wandering spirits, hungry spirits, things like that. So putting out lights outside, especially as a way of guiding the dead to a better place at this sort of liminal time of the year. It's also a thing, around Halloween, because Halloween is also that, a thinning time.
That time.
So putting out
Yeah.
candles and fires and things like that as a way of sort of guiding the spirits through the darkness. Yeah, I think that it has ancient origins, but yeah, you can still see that around today. I like the idea of traditions started at one time of the year and then finished at another. So, having the Yule log and then burning it at the summer solstice. I really like stuff like that.
It's a way of continuing the wheel in an
Absolutely.
intimate
Yeah.
way. I found in doing research that at times in Norse tradition and Anglo-Saxon tradition, they would do an entire feast and leave it out
Mm.
overnight as an offering to the ancestors.
Mm.
Um, are there any native traditions towards that end in the Ozark area?
What do you mean, like indigenous traditions? Mm.
Yeah, for the solstice.
Um, a lot of the indigenous traditions have been so mixed in that it's kind of hard to piece them apart. Certainly, there's
Okay.
traditions surrounding certain plants, mistletoe, but the mistletoe traditions would have actually been brought in from Europe. I think red cedar is probably one of our strongest indigenous connections, but it also connects back to, German folk culture as well as Highland, Scotland culture, both of which honored juniper as a power plant. And red cedar is not a cedar, it's a juniper. Juniperus virginiana, but it's a New World juniper that we have around here
Okay.
and through the Appalachians as well. So this is one of those powerful plants. And so people would traditionally bring it in as a part of their greenery. And a lot of those traditions have sort of translated into, well, it looks pretty, so we bring it in garlands and things like that. But I mean, there's a double meaning behind that. Traditionally, this was a protecting plant as well. So you would bring in boughs of red cedar to protect your house. And the protection is really, this is a time of liminal space. So, not only are your, good ancestors coming through, but, there can be some not so good stuff coming through as well. So this idea of hanging up greenery and boughs of, this red cedar, juniper, as a way of protecting the home, I think is pretty important. And that probably is the most indigenous connection. There's a lot of the indigenous traditions have been so mixed in, it's kind of hard to piece them all apart. But certainly plant traditions would have come from, most of our plant traditions would have come from indigenous sources. But surrounding holidays, specifically like the big holidays in the Ozarks, which is, the big one is Christmas time. Like that is the big time of the year. Halloween was not really observed very much apart from, maybe a bonfire here and there. And then, there were isolated other sort of holidays throughout the year. Harvest home, bringing in the fields and things like that would have been celebrated. But Christmas time, this would have been the big time of the year. And so there's a lot of sort of protection rites that go on at this time. It's a big time for divination because it is, the veil is considered to be thin, so you can actually get more information. Traditionally, magical healers and practitioners would do extra divinations for clients at this time of the year, or maybe for their work for the year. They may, do a certain scrying or divination. This is a time when people, not so much anymore, but in the old days, they would have a dumb supper, which is a sort of divination to find your husband, or wife. Traditionally, it was women that performed the dumb supper, so usually they were looking for a husband. But that it was a good time for that, or divinations in general. So people would have, sort of party games and things like that. But then as a part of that, they would have divinations that they would do as a part of gaming sessions and stuff during these holiday parties. So for instance, they would make pendulums out of Bibles. So, they would wrap string around a Bible and use it as a way of answering questions. So, which way the Bible spins will answer yes or no to certain questions. And in a lot of cases, I think for the older folks, it was a little bit more of a serious rite, and sometimes seen as a dangerous rite. And for the kids and the young people, it was more of a game. But yeah, you still sometimes see that around. But I think today a lot of the magical associations have sort of not been lost, but they've been isolated with practitioners, which is kind of always the case. The practitioners are always going to be the ones that keep the rites and the rituals of the holidays. But I think a lot of people just sort of they have a lot of the traditions, they just don't know the purpose or origins behind the tradition, which is fine. That's kind of part of my job is, telling people what their traditions mean. So I'm always happy to do that. But as far as like actual indigenous traditions, there's not a lot that hasn't been mixed in. So before Ozark people got to the Ozarks, they had already been in Appalachia for a couple hundred years, mixing with indigenous cultures there to the point where it was hard to differentiate at times hill folk from indigenous communities. A lot of times the indigenous communities themselves were mixed indigenous European, and sometimes Black as well. There's a heavy African influence in Appalachia as well.
Melungeon.
And there's other, Roma people, the Romani people came over at multiple points with different immigrations, and they kind of get lost in a lot of the stories. But so all of these cultures have kind of already been mixing for so long that it was, the practices became unique to the communities. And then, of course, that came to the Ozarks. By the time the hill folk got here, the Osage, who had been here since the early 1500s, had already been removed to Oklahoma. So there weren't really any new indigenous communities that the hill folk would have been encountering, apart from maybe isolated, individuals that had stayed behind and things like that. So the indigenous traditions, they don't stand out as a part of the culture as much, just because there was such a heavy mixing in Appalachia. Now you do have indigenous communities still here, isolated communities in the Ozarks. At one point, there was the old settler Cherokee, who were basically Cherokee from the east out in Appalachia, who were given land in the Ozarks before the Indian Removal Act. And in some cases, they had a pretty heavy influence upon local communities, to the point where in certain parts of the Ozarks, you still have stomping grounds and things like that. But, and of course, there's indigenous families who have moved back to the area and things that have, I'm sure, traditions of their own. But as far as, the old Ozark culture, I think it became such a mixture of a lot of different things. It's sometimes hard to piece it apart. I think in, sort of cross-culturally, there's this idea of, the winter being a dark time of the year. And so your traditions are aimed at working with the sun, working with illumination, working with bringing that light back, bringing the light into the family, things like that. And you see that in both European and indigenous traditions, kind of across the board. Because, both of these things are based in our ancient ancestors observing the world around them. So, at this time of the year, they observed that it was darker and they were scared about it continuing to become dark. So that, of course, influenced a lot of the traditions.
At times when there's some pretty bad volcanic action on the Earth, there'd be winters where you didn't have light for a prolonged period of time because of that, and people that stays in people's memory, and so they would develop traditions, and in the darkest part of the year, they'd want to focus on lighting their home and kind of trying to invite the sun to come back.
Yeah, and I mean, on a practical level too, it's a mood booster because if you don't have the sun, I mean, you don't have the vitamin D, you get depressed, and so this was really an important time, not just for all of the sort of magical supernatural traditions, but also for just boosting the mood to just keep everybody going. I think one of my personal traditions, because I actually really enjoy wintertime, but I tend to hibernate. So I tend to get very lethargic, things like that. And so one of my personal traditions around the solstice and then also Christmas time, is this idea that, we're reaching the darkest, and sometimes I just tell this to myself, is like, we're reaching the darkest point of the year, but, for as dark as we are becoming right now, there is a stopping point. And, the solstice especially, I always like to say this, from here on out, the sun is growing, and that's something to look forward to.
Mm-hmm. The slow return of the sun from its slumber.
And I'm sure you all still have daylight savings time and things like that. Do you do daylight saving time there? So, and that's one of the things that it always really upsets me, because I like watching the falling and the rising of the sun throughout the year, and daylight saving time always just breaks that up in such a bad way. And so I always, this time of the year, I try to get up a little bit earlier, so that I can still observe that. because it is amazing. Here it's hard because there's so many hills and things like that, but I kind of live in a flat area, and it really is just kind of amazing to be able to see, the sun dipping down every day lower and lower, and then it reaches a point where it stops, and then you see it start coming back up. And I think that's one of those things that, like, I like connecting to that because I feel like it connects back to my ancestors, the ancient ancestors who would have only had their eyes to observe the world. They wouldn't have had, things to measure time with and things like that. Yeah, so yeah, that's my complaint about daylight savings time.
I don't really see a purpose.
Not anymore,
in it.
no.
There's absolutely no, even for growing, there's no purpose to it, because as you've said, if you use your eyes and observe the path, you don't need that measure. I think it was just for businesses that they developed that, so that they would have time in the lit hours of the day where they could be in the office doing their work, having to squint their eyes too much.
Yeah, and I mean, now it's like kind of pointless, because we're not working by candlelight and stuff like that anymore, or whatever.
We have a large Asiatic influence here, and they don't particularly do Christmas, but their New Year comes the middle of January. But throughout Christmas, because everyone else is celebrating, there's fireworks throughout that time period.
That's kind of an old tradition here in the Ozarks too, setting off fireworks Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve. There is some, folklore surrounding it, the idea that at these dark times, what scares away the evil spirits is light and sound. So, the crashes and bangs of with fireworks, you have the both of them. So you have the sound and as well as the light. And so that is, out where my parents live, they live kind of out, although now it doesn't seem so far out because everything's kind of building up towards them. But, even out there where there aren't any regulations for fireworks because they're outside city limits, but Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve, you hear fireworks going on, in the hills around. Traditionally, there was a belief with gathering mistletoe. So there's lots of ancient traditions around gathering mistletoe. I mean, there's the legend that the Druids would only use a golden sickle to gather it. Again, gold connecting to the power of light and the sun, all that. In the Ozarks, for a long time, there was a tradition that you had to shoot it out of a tree. So, people would shoot it out with shotguns and things like that. And I don't know if that's an actual magical tradition around it or whether it was just convenience to be able to reach some of the mistletoe high up in the trees. But generally speaking, fireworks, light, sound. Sometimes, in older families, there would just be a moment, usually midnight, Christmas Eve, turning into Christmas Day or New Year's, where people would just go out and start hollering, just shout and stuff like that as a way of sort of bringing in the new year or ringing in the new year or, ringing in Christmas Day, things like that. And of course, music is a huge part of Ozark culture. So generally speaking, family gatherings are centered around food and music and storytelling. And music, I think, is another way of connecting to that power of sound as a way of banishing the negative stuff, banishing the demons and stuff like that. But also attracting the good spirits too, because there's a belief that the ancestors and the spirits of the land will follow the good music and come into the house and things like that.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot on vibrations in magical practice, and that singing is something that happens quite often. You sing the prayer to a god or goddess and draws their attention to you. My own family, they would ring a little silver bell 3 times at midnight on Christmas Eve, and that I never understood the reason behind it, but just talking about that now, I have an idea.
I really like that tradition of ringing the bell at midnight. That's really cool. I agree wholeheartedly with the idea that vibrations have this sort of magical quality to them. I think it's the idea that there's still this sort of sensing presence that you cannot see. And so even if you can't hear the words, you can still feel the words, or you can still feel the vibrations. And I don't know, I think the animist in me is this this idea of how do we talk to the spirits of the land when we don't speak the same language. And I think vibration can do that. You don't have to speak the same language, but the vibrations carry your intention, they carry your power. You can deliver it to the air around you and to other people and to the land. I like that.
It's very interesting how that always comes into every practice I've ever had, and it's part of physics as well.
Mm-hmm.
Everything has a harmonic quality to it because it's both wave and particle. It's just very interesting how we found that through spiritual practices and then continued it. Like a lot of singing traditions come from religious practices, and whenever people gathered, they would have a party. So singing and dancing would be part of it. And the holidays aren't any different. Do you find that in this liminal portion of the year that a lot of Day of the Dead type things start happening?
Yeah, I think there's a big sort of connection there between a lot of the Halloween traditions and the winter traditions. And it's interesting because, in the Ozarks, there are other sort of liminal times of the year as well. Easter is sometimes considered that, but it's not as big. It's not, and then, of course, like summer solstice in other traditions, May Day, things like that. I guess in the Ozarks, May Day used to be kind of a big time of the year, but the times that have really carried over are Halloween and the winter traditions. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we do have such an association between darkness and the dead. This idea of shades, or the thinning veil. The veil is thin at dawn and dusk. These sort of dark, in between dark and light times. And so I think a lot of the dead traditions sort of naturally fit in with colder temperatures of the year. In the Ozarks, the fall and winter is when the fog descends into the valleys. And so you have this sort of ethereal feel to the world. And so that's just a personal theory of why they've survived as sort of death tradition times. But yeah, Christmas, used to be as much of a death holiday as Halloween was. There's a long tradition of telling ghost stories on Christmas Eve and things like that. We can even see it with Christmas Carol as a Victorian ghost story at Christmas time. So it has ancient origins. This idea that this is a dark and cold time of the year, and I think it's a time to recognize that the dead, your ancestors and wandering spirits, are kind of out at this time, but then also it's a time to recognize your own mortality as well. This idea that, you know, we are coming to a time where we will also fade, and I think winter is kind of a natural representation of that. As we see the leaves falling off the trees and, you know, things dying in the forest, we're reminded of, you know, our own mortality. And I think it just kind of flows naturally into the winter holidays. For me personally, I really like feeling out certain traditions of the year, or times of the year. Especially a lot of the old associations. I was actually talking to some friends the other day about this. A lot of the old associations of holidays like Beltane or Mabon, things like that, that have certain correspondences with them. They don't really work here in, you know, the American South. So, no. For instance, we were talking about, like, I guess it was the autumnal equinox, which traditionally is the harvest time. Well, not here. We have our harvest time is usually later. It's usually in October. You know, things are still growing. You know, I had friends still growing vegetables in their garden well into October this year. So for here, our harvest festival is much more likely to be sort of combined with Halloween, with the sort of Halloween traditions. So I always encourage people, you know, that are wanting to work with the Wheel of the Year to sort of feel out the Wheel of the Year in your bioregion, as a way of, you know, determining that stuff. So to go back to sort of the death rites and sort of death associations, you know, I was talking to a friend one time who lives in Florida, South Florida, and for them, Christmas is like is a celebratory. It's not necessarily considered a part of death because nothing around them is dying. You know, it's all growing still. So yeah, here, you know, it's always had this association with death, with ancestors, with your own mortality, things like that. But yeah, I'm sure that can change, you know, depending on where you are. And of course, once you go to the Southern Hemisphere, it's a summer celebration. So.
Well, here on the island, on average, the last few years have been different, but this year has been more the norm. We have rain instead of snow. And temperatures hover between 30 and 45 Fahrenheit. I'm guessing because we measure it in Celsius here, so it's usually between 2 and 10 degrees Celsius here, and because we're close to the mountains, it gets darker here quicker.
Right. Yeah.
So by everywhere else in the country, it's light until around 6 o'clock. At 4 o'clock here, it's getting dark.
Yeah.
And it doesn't turn light until around 7:30 in the morning, usually. So, and it's just now here, starting to get to full light, and it's almost 8 o'clock. So when you talk about things being different, following the Wheel of the Year, where you're at is very important to connecting to the land. In way of connecting to the fairy side of things, are there any traditions towards that happen?
Usually, so, you know, the idea that you never want to exclude them from partying, you know, so anytime, you know, you have a gathering, whether any time of the year, you always want to include the land spirits and the little people in any way that you can. It's just naturally, you know, winter traditions, Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, Old Christmas, are just have traditionally been the big times of the year that people got together. But today, there are more things that are included. I mean, Thanksgiving here is now a big holiday,
Mm-hmm.
and has been for long enough that a lot of those traditions have carried over to Thanksgiving as well. Because traditionally, Thanksgiving is a time when people got together and partied. And so you always want to include the fairies, the little people in that as well. And that's usually just leaving out food for them somewhere, food and drink. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that drink varies from household to household, but sometimes people will do milk if it's especially if it's a family that is kind of teetotalers.
Yeah.
But traditionally it would have been an alcoholic drink as well. And there's always there tends to be a separation between offerings in the house and outside of the house, and usually people will leave them in both. Occasionally, you'll have families that choose one or the other. And personally, for me in my house, I always leave offerings in the house and outside of the house, just because the idea that inside of the house is for ancestral spirits, house spirits, things like that. Outside of the house are for wandering ghosts, hungry ghosts, as well as land spirits that might come along. And you want to keep both of those happy around you. So,
True.
but because this is a liminal time of the year where the other world is seen as being closer to our world, there's lots of stories about weird happenings specifically around Christmas Eve, Christmas Day. This idea that, midnight on Christmas Eve is a dangerous time of the year. You don't want to be caught on the road wandering back to your house. It's better to just stay the night where you are. Because you could easily find yourself in the other world, not even know it until it's too late. So there is this idea of, caution towards the other world at this time of the year. The idea that it's not only good spirits that are coming over, but there could be not so good spirits or just trickster spirits that also come through at that time. Traditionally, in the old Ozarks, there are always sort of humorous stories about this that are shared as well. People wandering down the road at midnight on Christmas Eve and get spooked by something and think it's the little people when actually it was a possum or something like that. But people would carry torches with them. People would carry branches of red cedar with them as ways of protecting themselves if they did have to travel around that time. But generally speaking, I mean, as far as the old stories go, people were very cautious about it. So either you left before midnight or you left after, in the early hours of the morning. You didn't try to do midnight on Christmas Eve. There are stories also. This was a time specifically for healers and magical practitioners who derive their gift from interactions with the other world. In a lot of the stories, those first encounters happened at liminal times of the year. So, Halloween or around Christmas time, an individual might find themselves in the other world and amongst the little people who give them the gift of healing in exchange for food or money or something like that. And so, a lot of the old stories talk about how this is a time for some of those first encounters to happen. Fairy marriages sometimes happen at this time, so which is a tradition that was brought over from pan-European traditions. But the idea of individuals entering into marriages with a fae being, and then in some cases, even producing offspring as, half fae, half human. Usually these individuals have some sort of inborn gift or power because of this marriage. So, the liminal times of the year, this is things that can happen just because the veil separating these two worlds is thin. Not that it can't
So true.
happen throughout the year, because there are stories that it definitely does, especially liminal sites. So, there are times of the year where the veil is thin, but then there are also locations, places where during the entire year, the veil is thin. So, but Christmas Eve has always had sort of in the traditional culture has always had this association with partying, but also with a good amount of respect for the other world.
Which is really good. Do you find that nowadays the only real time that people do connect to the other world and connect kind of to nature itself is around Christmas
I
time?
think today there's less of a focus on holidays, as far as I've been able to tell from the majority of the sort of neo-traditional practitioners I've encountered, and even in my own life, I've found that the connection is much more towards the land these days. So, for instance, in my own practice, I don't work with a lot of holiday traditions. I work with full and new moons. So I leave out offerings on full and new moons. I do a lot of healing work and magical work on full and new moons, a lot of spirit work on those times, because those are also considered liminal times. I do more of that than holidays, really. I think having not really grown up with a family that really did anything specifically with like the equinoxes and solstices and the old holidays and things like that. I think a lot of my practice has developed around modern American holidays. So, and I kind of, at one point I was working on, it was going to be a chapter in the book, but I ended up not having enough space. It might end up being its own thing eventually, but one of the things that I've talked with students about is this idea of developing your own holidays that make sense to celebrate in your family, that can also be connected to ancient holidays. For instance, in America, 4th of July, historical implications aside, 4th of July is a summer holiday. It's not on the summer solstice, but it's still a summer holiday. It's pretty close to the summer solstice. It's not that far away. So, if you are a practitioner who can't necessarily celebrate the summer solstice for whatever reason, make your own holiday, incorporate it in with 4th of July. In a lot of cases, what I found personally was, now I have a community of people, and we celebrate the solstices as much as we can, and the big holidays, Halloween, things like that. But there for a while, I didn't really have anybody to celebrate these things with. So it just ended up being me by myself. So what I was thinking was, why not redefine the holidays that are sort of important to my life and to my family and community and things like that. So it kind of makes you think about the holidays a little bit different. So Thanksgiving, American Thanksgiving as a harvest holiday. Christmas as a winter solstice holiday, Easter as a springtime holiday, things like that. And I think that is actually, it's what our ancestors would have done. I imagine back to my first ancestors who were sort of thrust into Christianity, what they would have done. And what they would have done was they merged their holidays. Yeah. And we see that all the time, across the board, the idea of, traditional culture merging holidays and beliefs with whatever predominant religion or spirituality came to them. And I think today, we have an opportunity, instead of, not to throw away the old traditions or anything like that, but we have an opportunity to sort of make them more meaningful to us. So for me, I don't celebrate a lot of the old holidays, but I do celebrate these sort of merged holidays. And they do sort of still figure in with my practice a little bit. But that's what I kind of see with neo-traditional practitioners, is that the associations are spread out through the year. They don't really necessarily have the big times of the year that they might celebrate. There's also, just because more and more people are influenced by European traditional witchcraft, there's much more of an emphasis put on Halloween as the big time of the year. And that's kind of disappointing to me, just because Christmas, winter traditions, they've been so important, not just in, more recent years, but also as a part of our ancient culture as well. And so I always encourage people, as serious as you are at Halloween with all your spirit work and, all of that, try it out at Christmas time or winter solstice time as well. And I think, you'll find that it's equally as powerful.
It comes down to, I think we've lost connection to our past a lot. A lot of families don't know their ancestral past. That isn't passed along until someone does genealogy and finds that out, or does genetic genealogy now, which gives you an idea of where you're from and who your people were. But a lot of people don't have that, so they basically have to go along and create their own thing and their own traditions, and that's beautiful in itself, because when you lack something, you have to find a way to make it work and make it feel important, right, and connect yourself to it. With my own family, we had some history, in that we had our family Bibles that basically housed 300 years of the family traditions, and all the obituaries of every person who has passed, all the births of people who have come. What my wife and I have been doing the last few years is combining old tradition with our own traditions, creating our own way of doing things. So we're both honoring the ancient ways and the modern ways. And I think whatever spirits are around are really liking that tradition that we're creating. And I think, some people that I work with, or practice magic with, they say that they want the experience of life, because not all of these spirits have had life like we do. And I think when they said that, it makes some sense that there will be some spirits that have never had a physical life like we do. Like some fey creatures may not have lived in this realm, right, as a physical being. Some gods may have never existed as someone on Earth. Though I've seen a lot of the deities or depictions of their archetype to have been people that were so well liked, and that they became a god. But I've seen that there's also archetypes that were never, like the land itself. Right. It's alive, but not in the sense like us. Right. It's different, and connecting to that was important back in the day. It didn't seem so important in the 80s and 90s while I was growing up to people as I wanted to do. I was kind of an outsider because of that. I connected to the land more than I did other people. I was always kind of a loner that way, but I had lots of friends too, so I could be social, but I preferred to be with nature.
Yeah, I was the same way growing up.
And but as people grow up, they want that connection to their past, and the Christmas sentiments around Christmas are very important to that. What's your thoughts?
I agree. In my family, you know, even though a lot of the family lives in the same area, I mean, Christmas has always been a time for everybody to get together, and you know, of course, you know, there's the idea of being able to just see family and being around them and things like that. But, you know, this has always been a time where, you know, you may not see these elders throughout the year. So, you know, they pass down stories and, you know, the everything that is passed down around these times, I think is still such an important thing, just because I think now more than ever, people are more and more isolated. And so coming back home or going to a place around the big holidays of the year, it's an important time to just, you know, be able to honor the family that's around still, honor the family that's not around, and also just being able to receive information from the elders and things like that. For me, it's a really important time. It's probably my favorite time of the year. I also really like Halloween, just because of those traditions. But you know, I look at it as, you know, my big spiritual magical time of the year is between, you know, October 1st and New Year's, pretty much.
Yeah.
That's like the big time, because I mean, here, you know, in my family, we have Halloween traditions, we have Thanksgiving traditions, we have Christmas traditions, pretty, you know,
Yeah.
these big holidays every month. And then, you know, things start falling off after the new year, and it's kind of this nice hibernation time where, you know, you're just kind of, you know, you're not exerting too much energy through the winter time. You're just sort of like storing up and reflecting and, you know, doing some inner work and stuff like that. And then you have the growth period, the springtime, the, you know, where you blossom out, and everything that you had cultivated during the winter time you sort of bring to fruition, or, you know, bring to sprout at this time.
Yeah.
So for me, like, I I don't necessarily like the commercialized traditions of Christmas, but for me, I love feasting. I love the idea, not just because I like food, but I like the idea of feasting with family and being able to share food together. It's such a primal activity. It's such a primal right. The idea of, and I think about this every year as like is usually around Thanksgiving, because that's the first like feasting, big feast of the winter. But I always think about how this would have been so important for my ancestors too. The idea that, you know, throughout the year, my ancestors, you know, probably everybody's ancestors, we didn't have as much food as we needed at times and things like that. And so feasts were really a time for nourishment. It was a time to nourish your body and nourish your spirit. I always, you know, people always ask me about, you know, well, I don't know how to form an ancestral work practice. I don't know how to make an ancestral shrine. I don't know rites to do, things like that. And I always say the most basic thing, and sometimes I think the most important thing you can do for your ancestors, is living a good life yourself, because you are an ancestral shrine. Your body is an ancestral shrine. And so feasting times of the year, especially in the winter, for me, for whatever reason, you know, as I'm feasting, I always think, you know, as my body is nourished, may my ancestors be nourished, and may all beings be nourished. And so, I love this time of the year. There's also a lot of shadow work that comes up this time of the year, things like that. But I look at it as all being good work, necessary work, things like that.
Yeah.
I used to not like Christmas time at all, but once I started connecting more with ritual work and just looking into this idea of nourishing the ancestors and nourishing spirits and things like that, it just kind of it became more and more important for me.
It's quite beautiful to do that. For me, I'm Canadian, so our Thanksgiving is in the beginning of October.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm married to an American, so we have both Canadian and American Thanksgiving every year. And so it's basically from October to January, it's all feasting.
Yeah.
And I love food.
Yeah.
That's my profession. I've been a cook for 26 years, and I love making food for people that I care about. I love making food for strangers because it is a process of showing you care. And the feasting time, you're showing by making the food and feasting with the people around you, you're giving them your love in a very tangible way that they don't even have to thank you. When everyone kind of goes silent and they're just eating, and you look around the table and you can feel the energy of that, all that love that went into it, they're taking it in, and then you're sitting back with maybe a few drinks afterwards and talking and reminiscing. It's perhaps the most magical thing you can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it reminds me, I mean, there is kind of a long Ozark tradition, and it has ancient roots, of course, but of bringing in a stranger or bringing in strangers as a part of the feasting. And the idea that is an integral part of the actual ceremony. This idea that, in ancient days, I mean, what more of a outward expression of love would have been than bringing in a complete stranger, not a part of your family, not a part of your clan or whatever, but bringing somebody in and giving away some of your vital food to this person. And that kind of has translated over the years in the idea of bringing in strangers, especially people who are not as fortunate. So bringing in people to feast, and the idea of it being completely not reciprocal. It's just an outward expression of love and altruism. This idea that I don't expect anything out of you apart from just eating with us.
Yeah. It's, to me, that's the most beautiful thing you can possibly do. It's the same as, well, it's like Ramadan.
Mm-hmm.
Ramadan is a very beautiful tradition, and I had the luck to be invited to one of the evening meals of a friend. His family came from Lebanon, and just the food, and it's a very giving tradition, and it was just beautiful. And of course, lots of pita. I love pita bread, but they had like 60 varieties of different breads and all kinds of different foods, most of which I've never had before and never had after. and they just invited this little kid in because my friend and I were hanging out that day, and he said, come back to my place." And instead of going to his place, we went to the big hall to have food. And I didn't get home till late, and my parents were upset because I didn't tell them that I was going there. No. But when I told them what I'd done, they were very happy for me that I had that experience. And it's just, we need to do that more.
Yeah, I agree.
Share.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, that's kind of a cross-cultural practice, this idea of bringing people into feasts. And I mean, like we were talking about earlier, it's such a primal thing, feasting and sharing food with people and being able to, bring people into that, you're welcoming people into your group, into your family, into your clan, things like that. So I always try to incorporate some of that into either Thanksgiving or Christmas time traditions, this idea of giving at this time of the year. And that extends not just to, physical beings, but also the spirit world as well. This idea that, give a little bit extra to the wandering spirits to help them along the way at this time of the year. Leave out maybe food outside a little bit more than you normally do to help the wandering ghosts and things like that. As a way of not just helping those beings, but then also, as a way of expressing your own sort of generosity and altruism and things like that.
Recently, we had we were on a bike ride, and we found this little hole of a place. And as soon as we walked in, we saw fairy doors everywhere. It was just everywhere. And we ended up, my wife spontaneously just said, "Oh, I'm going to leave an offering," and left some food she had in her pocket, and poured some water on the earth to give back for the opportunity to see that beautiful place. And then we got home, and not long after that, we had an explosion of activity in the house. It wasn't bad activity. It was just, we had some tunes being knocked on the walls, and sing-song voices every once in a while, and that sort of thing. I think when we did that just spontaneously, it really made something happy.
Yeah. I mean, and also, I mean, things like that travel, I mean, too, the idea that, the spirits of the other world talk to each other as well. I mean, they communicate with each other as long as they're able to do that. So the idea that by giving offerings in this spot that was sort of revealed to you, the spirits of your own home were happy by that. Something maybe opened up through that I guess nonverbal communication of leaving offerings.
Yeah. It was just, and since then we've had some interesting things. Our house fairy keeps showing itself as our cat, and it's odd that it does that, and we haven't seen the butterfly since a few months ago, so that's weird too. We haven't seen that, but we've had the mimicking of Merlin. It's even mimicked my wife and I both. Basically, when I gave them Samhain feast, I gave them a bit of everything that we were eating that day. And I heard her say thank you.
Hmm.
And it wasn't her. She had her headphones on and was engrossed in her game and not paying any attention to me at all. So someone was very happy at that. And then uh, that night, we were listening to a live séance with Greg and Dana Newkirk. We were listening to that, and we heard bells and weird chimes in the bedroom. And I got up to look, and there was nothing there that could have moved. Though Sarah has a particular, it's an Asian style bell, like a claw bell. That makes a very distinct noise, and it wasn't that we heard. It was more like the tinkling bell, like a crystal bell type thing. Weirdly, my grandmother had that.
Oh, wow.
And part of our dedication was to her, or her as well as my parents.
Wow.
So hearing that bell was basically them saying, "Okay, we're here," and that was very special that night.
Yeah, I that always gives me shivers. Like signs like that is, I mean, in the Ozarks, you know, people, especially if you're connected to sort of more traditional culture, like there's always this idea that you're looking for tokens or these omens in the world, and there's lots of stories about different things, but it's different when you actually experience that sort of confirmation that, you know, from the other world or from your ancestors that, you know, you're doing good work, we're here, we're listening, or, you know, or just, you know, we're with you.
It's very important to observe those when they happen and really take them in. I've had a few situations where that's happened. Our wedding day was one. It was pouring rain, and about half an hour before the ceremony was to take place, and we were doing it outside, the clouds parted and the sun came out for about 3 hours. And both my parents had passed at that point, so it was like they were wishing us a good day.
Wow. Yeah, giving you a little bit of a clear sky blessing. I like that.
And have you had many things like that happen?
Yeah, I've had a few. You know, in Ozark culture, seeing butterflies is, you know, kind of a token or an omen that there's a loved one or a spirit who's kind of around you. I was in this particularly magical part of the Ozarks that I got introduced to earlier this year, and got to spend quite a bit of time at throughout the year. But it's just kind of a magical nature preserve. So it's not pristine, but it is about as pristine as you can get around here anymore. But yeah, I was just kind of in this magical place, and there was lots of spirit activity and stuff that went on there. But one of my first trips there, I was down at the creek and just listening to this waterfall, and I just had this feeling that, you know, my ancestors were there with me, and my spirits and guides and things. There was just this overwhelming sort of presence at that place. And, you know, I just decided to kind of do a little bit of meditation. And as I was meditating, about 6 or 7 butterflies just like landed and stayed on me for a good while. And it was eerie and kind of amazing, and a nice affirmation that the presence that I was feeling was there. It was actually there. A lot of the signs that I get are natural, like sort of nature based. But then occasionally, waking up having heard, a past loved one's voice or something like that. That's happened quite a few times. And years and years and years ago, it always freaked me out, and I usually wouldn't be able to get back to sleep being like, well, what did they want? Did I miss a message? What? But now, if it happens, I'm just like, oh, they're just like, they're just saying hi. Especially, for a lot of spirits, at least in my view, time is a little bit different. So they might not have even known they were waking me up. They just, were saying hi when they wanted to say hi and didn't really understand, the when it was, or, when it was happening, things like that. So yeah, it's always nice receiving stuff like that.
Yeah. The perception of time between the two realms. I've had some situations where, speaking of earlier when we were talking about during midnight on Christmas Eve, if you were walking out and you could cross over into the Fey realm or into the other side. I've had situations where something like that happened. A few years ago, I was coming home from work, and all of a sudden, our street right now, it's a paved street, but 40 years ago it was a dirt road. All of a sudden, I was walking, and everything changed, and it was a dirt road. I walked up to our front door. We have cobbles that go into our front door that are original to then. And I picked up a package that was there for me. But when I picked it up, I realized I was wearing bell bottoms. I don't ever wear bell bottoms. So 40 years ago, it would have been 70s.
Well, yeah. Oh, man. Yeah. I've had some similar experiences. Around here, a lot of the, if you hike through the woods, there's a lot of these liminal spaces still. A lot of them have been destroyed, unfortunately, over the years. But, they're around here, because we have so much forested land, there are so many trails, hiking trails around. And trails, they don't take into consideration the spiritual landscape. So I've been on trails before where I stopped in the middle of the trail knowing that I was going to pass through one of these liminal spaces that, the trail builders were just like, oh, this goes by this pretty waterfall. But I knew that, I needed to leave out some offerings, things like that, because, you could pass through pretty easily. From an Ozark perspective, there's this idea that the other world and this world are exact mirrors of each other. And that makes it all the more difficult to sometimes tell whether or not you've passed into the other world. The only way usually is the other world has a different sort of quality of light. And of course, different beings are in the other world. But it's really interesting to look at the idea that, from an Ozark perspective, the buildings that are in this world are also in the other world. As we build and destroy things in this world, they're built up and destroyed in the other world, which, makes you reconsider your presence in the world a little bit more and reconsider the things that you do, because you may be destroying an old shed, but in the other world, it might be a residence for something. And also just the temporal differences too. I've experienced that before, where I've kind of wandered into a part of the forest that clearly had bigger undergrowth than it should have. There was one time I always like hiking in the winter, the fall and winter, because there's no ticks and snakes and stuff. And I remember this one time, and around here we have a big problem with the bush honeysuckle, which is an invasive from East Asia. And because it's used to colder climates in China, it stays green well into the winter. But this was after all of the honeysuckle had died out. And so I was wandering through this part of the forest and just kind of entered into this little valley area, and there were plants blooming. There were plants growing that, 2 to 3 months ahead of time. And it felt eerie at the time. It felt like there was that sort of presence there. So I always take offerings with me, usually like a bag of oatmeal, like dried oats and tobacco and stuff. And so I left out some offerings as I passed through and came back out of it back into winter, and just went along my way. And the rational part of my mind was like, well, maybe it was a protected sort of sheltered valley area where, the cold air couldn't get to. But then also I was like, well, I mean, either way, it was a space of presence. It was a space of that liminal presence. And so whether, whatever explanation was the fact around it, it doesn't change the feeling that I had there. And so, yeah, I've had other encounters like that before, and it's really interesting. But I can also recognize how for people who aren't necessarily used to working in that space, and certainly for our ancestors, it would have been something they did not want necessarily, and wanted to protect against and try not to, because I mean there are lots of Ozark stories, and whether or not they're true or not, but people wandering into the other world and then coming back years later, not knowing where they were, things like that. So yeah, it's it's one of those, I guess, unless you're used to working in that space, it can be kind of jarring. And dangerous at times too.
True. Skipping a few years and coming back out, a lot can change in those 3 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Or there's lots of stories about fairy games and people unknowingly participating in games where they lose body parts and get beat up and all sorts of stuff. But then, of course, there are also stories about. Usually, the stories are centered around, personality types. So if it's and according to the old stories, a person who is naturally sort of greedy, the spirit world knows that and can pick up on it almost immediately. A person's intentions, a person's true intentions, and that usually is reflected in the games and the sort of deals that they do. Usually, the people that are arrogant or greedy or tricky themselves will be tricked by these spirits, whereas the stories about children, for instance, wandering into these spaces are usually always helped in the Ozark stories by the little people who show them out, and in some cases, they'll give them gifts too. So we'll help you back home, and here's a gift that you'll be able to heal later on in your life, or you'll have some sort of magical power later on, things like that. So a lot of the healer stories that I've heard from people who have had encounters like this, they have come out of the encounters in a good way because of their natural sort of empathy or altruism or their good state. But then, of course, you have people who traded. I met a guy who had lost an eye in one of these fairy dealings, and a guy who lost the use of one of his hands in one of these fairy trades. So yeah, it's I don't know. I feel like the other world is often portrayed as dangerous and unpredictable, but it's dangerous and unpredictable because we don't understand the rules fully. And, this world is equally as dangerous and unpredictable if you don't understand the rules of the place where you are. And I think I always tell that to my students and other practitioners, like, that are terrified of working with the other world. And I'm like, well, you should respect it, but it just takes understanding the rules, and then you can get around a lot of bad situations.
Definitely. Well, I think we should end it here on this interesting note.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on again. This is our second episode. So, and it's an important episode in that it's for the Yule time of the year.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm already gearing up for the Yule season. It's a good time of the year for me.
Yeah, it's great. Yule is a time of remembering our ancestors, for being with friends and family. It's a time of feasting and merriment. We honor those who came before us. We honor those who are with us. And we honor those we love. With this horn, let the festivities begin. The following is some toasts, posts, and stories from friends and acquaintances.
Hi, my name is Anastasia Sofia Munson Rodriguez. I would first like to thank AJ, our virtual campfire host. AJ was my boss at Planet Organic many years ago in the deli and is still the best boss I have ever had. I am going to do an art boast for this podcast because I am a local artist who has participated in many art events, markets, and showcases. I'm currently selling cards of my graphite pencil drawings for the holiday season, and I also do commission work for anyone who is interested. In addition, I am selling prints of my graphite pencil drawings. Photos of all of this artwork will be displayed with this recording. Please let me know if you are interested. I would be happy to talk about art ideas with anyone. Thank you very much, AJ, for this opportunity. I wish everyone a safe, memorable, and indulgent holiday season. Cheers!
This holiday season, I raised my glass in honor of my grandfather, Matthew Smith Jr., who was bold enough to leave the South, head west to California, where there were jobs in the shipyards for minorities during the war effort. That changed his life, the life of his family, and of course mine. I never got to meet my grandfather, unfortunately, but if I did, I'm sure I could have learned many things from him. So, grandfather, here's to you. Kapla.
Hi, this is Osella Cortese from the Chance to Have It All show, wishing you and yours a wonderful holiday season.
Hi, this is Pat Vegas of Redbone, wishing everybody a Happy New Year and Merry Christmas, and God bless you all.
We just want to say thank you for listening. We wish you all a happy holidays and joyous new year. Please join us for our first season, January 17th. We are available on all major platforms, including YouTube. Please subscribe, like, or follow on whichever platform you listen on. This podcast is a production of Mystere Creations Archive. It is written by Sarah Getchie, hosted and engineered by AJ Lunn. The intro and outro music is by Daniel Zambo, and all other sound effects and music are under fair use law.